Hi, my name is Sydney Williams. I'm the Education Coordinator for Nanticoke Watershed Alliance, and today we're going to talk about pots for pollinators. So it's mostly container gardening, but it can be adapted if you have like raised beds or you want to do a little garden in front of like around your walkway or in front of your house. I know a lot of people plant plants there, so this would also work in that sense as well. But containers are perfect if you have a small yard, you're renting, or you have an apartment and you just have a balcony. It's a great way to not only kind of spruce up your space and give it some color, but provide just like a little pocket of habitat for passing pollinators or seeds for birds as they go by. So native plants are plants that naturally occur in a particular region, ecosystem, or habitat that have been here without human introduction. Okay. So native plants, they help the environment most when they're planted in places that match their growing requirements. They'll thrive in the soils we have here, the levels of moisture we have here, our weather here, so they're all sort of have evolved to be the best species for the region. So that means that they'll need less water, less time with maintenance. They'll have less issues with pests, so you won't have to use like chemicals on them or fertilizers on them as often. And so they also provide basic resources for wildlife, so shade, shelter, food, and nesting sites for small beneficial insects, but also for birds, hummingbirds, and small birds you see like around in the city if you live there. Okay, and our native pollinators, they're insects and also animals that have evolved over time alongside our native plants. So they eat the nectar from the plants and move pollen from plant to plant, which helps them reproduce. So since they've co-evolved, they're so dependent on one another. The plants need the pollinators so that they can reproduce, and the pollinators need the plants for nectar, food, and in some cases, reproduction and shelter. Okay, so some of our native pollinators in Maryland and Delaware include flies, bees, beetles, butterflies, moths, and hummingbirds. And then there's two different types of pollinators. So we have our generalist pollinators. They'll visit many types of plants, but that means that there's a less chance for the pollen of the same species to fertilize each other, which many plants need to reproduce. And these pollinators are important, and they're the ones you often see feeding on your annuals in your garden or as you're walking through the park or on a hike. And then there's specialist pollinators, and these types of pollinators have evolved to form a specific relationship with one type of pollen found on one type of plant, or in some cases there'll be a few plants, but so these pollinators will come out of their nest when their plants are flowering. So like our native squash bee will only seek out its respective type of food. It won't go and collect nectar or drink pollen from any other types of plants. While generalist pollinators will visit these plants, they're not as effective at pollinating them. Okay, so before you start thinking of or start going to get your plants and your materials and everything, you want to think about where you want your pots of plants to live or where you want to plant them in the ground. So how much sunlight does it get? Where is that sunlight coming from? Like north, east, west, south? Is it full sun all day? Is there shade for part of the day? Is there always shade? So that's going to affect the type of plants you can grow. Kind of ties into location, but also thinking about if you have rain gutters, I put a plant under there last year. It did not fare well after a large rain event. So to think about if it's going to have a large amount of water falling on top of it, in some cases, what are the conditions like? Does the wind on that side of your house really blow hard all through the day? Because that might damage your plants. And then also think about watering. Not only is it really sunny all day and windy, so it's going to dry out quicker, but how far away from your house is it? You might have to carry the water there. How convenient is it to water? And then you get to pick your plants, which we're going to start talking about now. So then you can choose your containers. So when you're thinking about containers for your plants, first you want to think about the size. Is it large enough to support the growth of your plants? How many plants do you want to put into that pot? And you also want to make sure it has proper drainage. It's really bad for the roots if water's just sitting around them, they will rot. So you want to make sure there's holes in the bottom of your container for water to drain out. And also the material makes a difference too. So containers made of clay or terracotta, they'll dry out much quicker than a plastic container might. So a plastic container will hold your water in better. You might have to water less, or a ceramic container. So that's that. Oh, and so when you're thinking about size, I'm sorry, let me go back. So if you're gonna put multiple plants in there, a mixed container, I would go with quarts because they're easier to sort of see how big that plant's gonna get. When you put plugs in, I think it leads to overcrowding in a pot. So I've found that if you start with like a 10-inch pot, you can do about 3 like quart-sized plants. If you have like a 12-inch pot, probably do 4 quart-sized plants. So as you go up every 2-inch size, you can add another plug. Okay, and then your potting mix. So potting soil isn't actually real soil. It's a soilless blend of ingredients they use to grow your plants. And it's actually the perfect medium for growing container plants because it drains a lot better than your average garden soil. It's lightweight, so it's easy to move around. If you change your mind after you plant, you put your pot somewhere, you can just pick it up and move it. It's easy to handle. The consistency is the same throughout. And it's really the best suited type of potting mix for if you're growing a lot of different types of plants. So you can make your own potting mix. So this is just a sort of general mix using peat moss or the cocoa coir fibers, perlite, compost, and lime. A lot of our plants here actually like acidic soils, so you would have to look more into the specifics of what your plant needs. But the lime, if you're using the peat moss, will bring down the acidity. And then we'll have to sit for about a week to bring that acidity down. So if whatever plants you're planting don't like acidic soil, then I just wouldn't, you'd want to wait a week. And then you can mix in a fertilizer blend. I do have a resource linked at the bottom for that if you want to make your own. I've never done that. I usually use one that is already made. So I'll use like Biotone. It's a Spoma brand. It's really good. It's organic. So there's no chemicals. It's not bad for the environment. And then if you don't want to make your own potting mix, I think if you're only going to do a few pots, it's probably not worth it to make your own. So you could buy a large bag of potting soil. And then to that, I usually add orchid bark, fine ground orchid bark, to increase the drainage. And I add the 1/4 cup usually of the Spoma brand, the Biotone, which really helps keep blooms on your plant longer, I've noticed, and you get more blooms. Okay. And then this just before we go into the plants. So when you can plant them with one species or you can mix them, but you just have to make sure they have similar water and light requirements, which we'll go into with the plants. So, and also you can make a couple different pots and then cluster them together. Not only does it make it easier for pollinators to find the plants, but I also think it looks really nice, and you can almost make like a really full sort of faux garden with your containers. All right, so I had some plants. Each of these will work together in a pot if you want to put them in there together. So there's blanket flower, cone flower, and evening primrose. And I tried to get plants, spread them across. So you have plants starting to bloom early in the spring all through November. So you're providing a different source of nectar from all these different plants for all these different species throughout the year. So like the evening primrose, it will flower earlier in the year. It is a biennial, so it won't always flower, but it flowers at night, so it's actually really good for moths. So they have some pollen at night. And then the blanket flower and the purple coneflower both bloom earlier in the summer, and they keep their blooms all the way through to fall. And then you can expect to see bees, butterflies, and birds. Birds really like the seeds from the coneflower and the blanket flower. They're always playing around in my pots up there with those plants in them. And this is in the handout you'll get. This just gives you the light requirements, the soil moisture, the bloom time, how large your plant will get, because that will help you with your pot selection sizes, and then whether it's perennial, annual, biennial. So these are just covering that sort of basic information. All right, and then more pollinator containers for sunny areas. I got sunflower, blanket flower again, and New England aster. And again, these will start, I think these actually bloom a little later, May through November for this one. So it's really important too to provide nectar and pollen for some of these pollinators at the end of the year when there's not as much available for them. So that source of food, it really helps, especially ones that are making any sort of migrations to butterflies and pollinators before they hibernate for the winter. And we have bee balm. I would keep this one by itself because it can be aggressive. Anything you try to plant with it, it will probably take over and strangle out. But it's really pretty. It smells great. It does really, really well in containers. It's super low maintenance. It's not very picky. If you just water it, it'll bloom for you for a couple weeks through the summer. It does get rather large, though, I will say. It gets pretty tall. And then if you have some partly shady areas, there's great blue lobelia, black-eyed Susan, and foxglove beard tongue. These plants like moisture as well, so you want to make sure you're watering these particular plants regularly. But you will expect to see hummingbirds, birds, bees, flies, and butterflies on these ones. And then if you have a shady area of your house that maybe only gets a couple hours of sun a day, you could do cardinal flower, Virginia bluebells, or columbine. And these attract bees, butterflies, birds, and hummingbirds. And then I did a woodland inspired one, maybe a little bit of foliage. So there's a lot of options besides the maidenhair fern out there for foliage plants. But, as like a sort of fun and creative one, you could do the dwarf crested iris, the wild geranium, and the maidenhair fern, give you that woodland feel. Wild geranium is a ground cover, and I've never grown that one in a container, but I have grown other ground cover plants in containers with other plants, and it has worked out. So you could give it a try, experiment, be creative with your container mixtures of plants. There are so many more plants out there than what I have on here too. So there's definitely something for everyone. And then after you have potted up your plant, when you are potting your plants, you want to make sure that the plant's not root bound when you put it in. So you want to just rub the bottom of the plant gently and get some of the dirt off. Any roots that are wrapped around, you want to make sure that you unwrap them. And then just when you're putting them in the soil that you're packing it down, not too hard, but enough to get rid of the air bubbles. And then follow-up care and plant maintenance. So just you watering your plants, make sure that you keep them watered so that they thrive. If you need to check if it needs water, you can stick your finger into the pot down to like your second knuckle. If that's dry or nothing sticks, no dirt, mud sticks to your finger, then it doesn't, then it needs to be watered. And then I just water it till it comes out of the bottom of the pot, the hole in the bottom of the pot. Fertilizing, like I said, native plants don't need fertilizer as much, but I have found that in pots, it helps them to be fertilized. So there's more blooms and they last a lot longer. And then deadheading and pruning. So deadheading is removing the spent flowers to encourage new flower or foliage growth throughout and then toward the end of the growing season. The only one on this list that I know deadheading definitely helps is the blanket flower. You'll get a lot more blooms on that. And then pruning. So just making sure that your plants aren't getting too crowded. I mean, eventually you will have to move your pots. You move those plants out of this, whatever pot you planted them in after a growing season or two into a larger pot. But until then, pruning like anything dead, obviously, but also like if they're sort of encroaching on each other's space, I just prune it back a little. Just make sure you don't do more than a third of the plant at one time or it will die. And then check for pests. So even though they're natives and they have less pest problems, it doesn't mean they can't have pest problems. So just check for pests so you can get them under control before your plants become unhealthy and they die. And then I have some resources listed here. So all these here are what I used. I did a soil testing one. If you are planting in the ground and you want to get a soil test, there's soil testing for Delaware. Maryland's extension office didn't seem to have that up and running yet, but this is UDEL extension office, and then University of Maryland also has one for our area, but it seemed that it was down currently. And I also have where you can buy plants. So these couple listed in between Delaware, Maryland, the eastern shore of Delaware, Maryland, and one in Virginia, all have native plants. And then I thank you all for attending, and I can answer any questions.
So today I am going to be talking about shrubs for small places. I decided to talk about shrubs because I think a lot of times they get overlooked. A lot of times if we're thinking woody, we're thinking about large trees, which are awesome, but we don't always have the space for those large trees. Or we're thinking about all those lovely little herbaceous perennials or annuals or biennials that can fit into really small spaces. What I would like to do, my goal today with this presentation is to introduce you to some shrubs and hopefully make you think about perhaps fitting one or two or more into your landscape. So first of all, what are shrubs? So shrubs are woody plants. So they are like trees in that you are going to continue to see them in all 4 seasons. So they're going to provide some great structure for you, great coverage, but they are a lot smaller than our typical trees. So again, not everyone has space for an oak tree that's going to become 100 feet tall. The shrubs that we're going to be looking at today are actually going to range anywhere from a foot tall, so a little teeny tiny shrub, to 30 feet tall. And that's in optical conditions that that shrub would reach that height. Shrubs can also, just like trees, they can be evergreen or they can be deciduous. And today we'll be looking at some that meet either of those categories. Also, the great thing about shrubs is that they're shapeable, so that you can prune those and you can keep those to a shape and to a height that meets your specific needs. So why should you look at putting some shrubs into your landscape? First of all, again, they provide that year-round structure. And believe me, I love perennials. They're really awesome, just gorgeous, and you know, during the growing season. And even sometimes after that, they can do some wonderful things in the landscape. But if you really want to draw wildlife, and that means insects like our great pollinators, songbirds, they need things like structure. They need a place, birds need a place to hide and perch. Insects need a place where they can safely overwinter. So shrubs can provide lots of function, just like trees can. Also, shrubs, if you select the right ones, they definitely can be used to create living privacy fences. And of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but you should be able to find a shrub that you find to be beautiful and would be a great addition to your landscape. Shrubs, like trees and perennials, also act as host plants for certain butterflies and moths. So they can provide a very critical ecological function in your yard. So when you're thinking about shrubs, I encourage you to think about what you want and what your priorities are. Because as you start looking into things, of course, everything can become more complicated the more that you learn. But if you do want to provide a function like acting as a host plant for butterflies and moths, that is something that you really have to keep in mind when you're looking at different shrubs. So there are certain considerations that we need to take as we are thinking about shrubs as well, along with the specific function and what our priorities are as a renter or a homeowner. We also need to take some practical things into consideration. So one thing, of course, and Sydney talked about this in her presentation, but soil type. That's really important, because if you have a wet area, then you need to make sure that you're only planting shrubs that are going to enjoy having wet feet. So when we say wet, it means that it always has moisture, such as a wetland or a marsh, or if you have, and you probably don't, but if you have a pond, a creek, or a river edge, some of you may not live in small spaces, some of you may have larger spaces. So those are different types of habitats that would be conducive to planting a wet shrub. Moist, in those cases, the soil may be well draining, and often a lot of plants like well draining soils, but it needs to retain moisture. And then dry would be, it's very, very well draining, and that soil does not retain moisture at all. So a lot of us have sandy soils. A sandy loam type of mix can be a nice moist soil, but just sand, often that is just going to be dry unless you amend the soil a lot. Light conditions. And again, this is touching on something that Sydney already talked about, but shrubs, just like any other plant, some of them need full sun, and that's 6 or more hours of direct sunlight each day. Some of them need partial sun, and that's 2 to 6 hours. And some of them, they're quite all right in full shade, which is less than 2 hours of direct sunlight. When we're thinking about shrubs, we should also be realistic on the amount of space that we have. So obviously the final size of the shrub is going to determine how many shrubs you can plant in that area. But you should think ahead about that. Do you want to be able to plant multiple shrubs, or would you be content just planting one shrub for that area? You also, again, really want to think about what you want that shrub to do in your landscape. So if we are gardening for wildlife and looking to provide food and shelter, we may be looking at things such as what or when does this shrub flower? What kind of fruit does it produce? Is it evergreen or is it deciduous? And if you're looking for privacy, of course, you want it to be evergreen. Shrubs can really beautify your yard. But again, we all may have different ideas of what beauty is. So again, just make sure that you are looking at things such as anything from the color of the bark to shapes and colors of the leaves. And of course, if you're looking for a showy flower, that would also be something to keep in mind. And again, just to drive that point home, if you're looking to provide a specific host plant for butterflies and moths to lay their eggs on so that those eggs can go through the instar process and turn into caterpillars, and basically it's the whole circle of life and you know, become adult butterflies and moths, you need to make sure that you have suitable host plants for specific species. So we are going to be looking at some specific shrubs that fit specific conditions. What I did, and this will be part of the handout, this is a big chunk of the handout, is you're going to be receiving this or have the option to receive it. You'll be provided with the legend and then with each of the shrub categories so that you can see that. I also put together 2 different plans that use multiple shrubs in each plan that provide specific functions. So first of all, with size, we have small, that's 1 to 3 feet, medium 3 to 6 feet, large is 6 to 15 feet, and then extra large is 15 to 30 feet tall. These are the eventual end game heights of those shrubs. We have full sun, partial sun, and full shade. And then we have special categories. So butterfly moth host, you're going to see an orange butterfly. A yellow bee is going to indicate that it's an excellent source of pollen nectar for bee populations. If you see the leaf with the perfect circle, which is what leaf cutter bees leave behind when they are setting up their brood cells, that's going to show you, hey, the shrub is great in providing bee nesting material. The magnet is pollinator magnet. It means it's a great source for a number of different pollinators, bees, beetles, flies, solitary wasp, etc. And then of course the bird is going to show us that, hey, it's a great source of food for birds. So one thing that a lot of us think about are early spring flowering plants, because there's a critical need when bumblebee queens in particular are emerging early on. So once the day hits 50 degrees, she gets a couple of those days and it's warming up the soil, she knows it's time for her to wake up. And she's been in hibernation all winter long, and she's really, really hungry, and she needs to get pollen so that she can start creating worker bees to go out and to do the hard work while she is laying eggs inside the nest. There are also a number of solitary bees who also are very busy in the early spring. So a lot of mining bees or digger bees, and you may have seen them in your yard. They leave behind little small holes in bare earth. So that's kind of a good way to see them, but they can be very small. So providing these early spring flowering shrubs are really going to help out our native bees in particular. So here are a couple of selections. We have a couple of extra large eastern redbud and serviceberry or shadbush. And then we have large, which is the high bush blueberry. All of these, in my opinion, provide beautiful but very different looking flowers in the spring. What's great about all of them is that you can fit them into your landscape no matter what amount of sunlight that area might receive. Keep in mind that if, for instance, you put, a red bud in a full sun area, you might have to water it more the first year. And you may also get fewer blooms in a really super shady area. The native high bush blueberry, it blooms well regardless of the situation. And those flowers, those blueberry flowers, are great for pollinators. Redbud is really interesting because the leaves of the redbud are used very often by leafcutter bees, and you won't see leafcutter bees until the summer. They really like the temperatures to be in the 70s. So you'll usually see them start coming out in July, and you will see these perfect circles cut into the leaves of things like redbud leaves. And that is a great positive. That means that you have leafcutter bees, and they are setting up for the next generation the next summer. So don't be alarmed if you see that. All of these are great sources for food for bees. They're all 3 butterfly moth host plants, and 2 of them are going to provide fruit for songbirds and other critters that are in your habitat. We also have a bunch of other fruity shrubs. These in particular are focused if you really want to provide food for bees and other pollinators, and also provide food for songbirds. These are all great selections. If you have an elderberry and you've seen it in bloom, you know how gorgeous it is and just how much of a pollinator magnet it is. It's just electric, and it will hum with a variety of pollinators. I love to just hang out next to my elderberry shrubs as they are flowering and check out and see who's in the community, who is coming to the buffet to eat that day. It is really amazing. Elderberry is one of my favorites. Another great thing about elderberry is that it has pithy stems. So they're semi-hollow, and a lot of solitary bees and wasps can use those stems for nesting. So not only are you providing a great source of pollen and nectar, but you're also providing habitat for the next generation of solitary bees and wasps. It's also obviously a great source of food for birds. My elderberries do not last on the shrub very long. I can tell you that much. The songbirds clean them out really, really quickly. So it's a great source of food. Elderberry is quite adaptable. You can plant it in any sunlight condition, and you're going to have a nice, viable shrub that's doing a lot of things in your landscape. It is a large sized shrub, according to the terminology presented to you. Next, we have a medium shrub, the black chokeberry. And obviously it produces chokeberries every year. It requires full sun or part sun. Again, it's a great source for both pollinators and for songbirds. It's also a host plant. And Possum Haw viburnum is also a large shrub. It's adaptable to any sunlight condition, and it's a host plant. And it also is, again, a great source of food for bees. And then the berries are a great food source for songbirds. Some people are looking for, I call them evergreeny shrubs. And I call them that because in the case of the southern bayberry and the sweet bay magnolia, whether they retain their leaves or how well they do so really depends on the weather conditions that winter. So if it's a mild winter, both of those should retain their leaves. Southern bayberry, of course, is a lot more compact plant. And if you're looking for a privacy hedge, it would be a lot more suitable, whereas sweet bay magnolia is a more sprawling shrub. Southern bayberry is a large shrub. It needs full sun or partial sun. It does provide berries to songbirds. Inkberry is a fantastic little shrub. It's medium size, so it's a lot more compact, and it is very easily pruned into the shape that you want. And I highly recommend it if you are looking for privacy. It will retain its leaves. It does produce berries. The southern bayberry and the inkberry, they both have male and female plants. So when you plant them, you need to make sure that you get both, unless you know that I have to say the female plants are a lot more common. So you want to make sure that there's a male plant somewhere in your neighborhood, for example, if you wanted to forego. But I would highly recommend just buying one male and then getting multiple female plants. That way you can have your fruit set to provide that food for songbirds. And sweet bay magnolia, like all of the magnolias, it has a super flashy, showy flower. So, you can't really go wrong with that if you're looking for a beautiful flower to enjoy. It is an extra large shrub. So many people probably don't know that we have several sensational small shrubs. So all of these shrubs only grow from 1 to 3 feet tall. So you're talking about very compact shrubs. First of all, showcasing the coastal azalea. Of course, if you have a lot of deer pressure, that might not be a good idea, but it does have beautiful flowers. So if you're talking about your showy, flashy flowers, there you go. Great food for bees and also songbirds. And it will grow in partial sun or full shade. The pasture rose is also, it has like very beautiful flowers, different shaped, but very lovely flowers, fragrant. Again, benefits bees and birds. It requires full sun or partial sun. And then lastly, you have New Jersey tea. Again, super fragrant, very flashy flowers. This is a great source of food for pollinators. It's also a host plant for butterflies and moths, and provides food for your songbirds. Even more so, it's highly adaptable. So it'll grow in full sun, partial sun, or full shade. So like I said, I put together just 2 really quick plans just to give you ideas on how you can use multiple shrubs in your landscape, no matter its size. I call this the little hedge plan, and you can see I use inkberry along our property, this would be along our property boundary, for example, or maybe you have a small garden area and you just want to hedge it in. You could plant inkberry, and you could stagger those with some plantings of New Jersey tea. That way you're getting some different sizes. You have a nice deciduous shrub that is very compact, but also packs quite a punch. So the New Jersey tea also is going to give you these, like, a lot of fragrance in the hedge, which a lot of people don't think about that often, but it's really nice to have distinctly smelling plants in the landscape. The inkberry is going to give you that 4-season privacy. So it's kind of like your heavy hitter in the situation. It's going to provide berries for songbirds as long as you have that male mixed in with the females. And again, it's highly prunable. The great thing about inkberry is that if it's happy in that situation, it can also thick it up. So over time, you could get, if you're looking for a hedge, it's perfect because you could get a nice mesh of inkberry. This plant I call the Buzzy Buffet. So we have 3 elderberries, 3 blueberries, and we have in the center our large flashy red bud with the early bloom time. The great thing again about elderberry, we have the pithy stems, so we can check that off for habitat for our awesome solitary bees and wasps. We have super blooms for those same critters in our landscape, and we have some very rich berries for our songbirds. The red bud is going to give you that central structure. You're going to get those gorgeous early season flowers for pollinators. And again, your leafcutter bees, they're going to go to that red bud. They're going to use those leaves for their nest. And lastly, blueberries are also going to provide some early season flowers for pollinators. And again, you're going to have a solid food source for birds and other critters in the landscape, perhaps even you, right? So here are some resources that I highly recommend when you're doing some research, because this is only a small sampling of the awesome native shrubs that we have. So first of all, this is a free publication. It's called Native Plants for Wildlife Habitat and Conservation Landscaping in the Chesapeake Bay Watershed. And it's something that U.S. Fish and Wildlife put out quite some time ago, but it's available in PDF form on the internet. The next resource is a book. So you would need to go to your favorite bookseller. Heather Holm, she does just an amazing amount of awesome research about our native bees. And she has this great it just came out in February, hardcover book about native wasp. And she's based out in the Midwest, so it aligns because she concentrates a lot on Midwestern and Eastern plants and their interactions with all of our native pollinators. So if you're really looking to put some things into play, especially for our native bees, I highly recommend Bees, an Identification and Native Plant Forage Guide, again, by Heather Holm. If you want to do some browsing of photos and look at some different characteristics about shrubs, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center has an awesome database of both images and just native plants. And then lastly, again, if you're in the Delaware portion of the Nanticoke River watershed and you'd like to sign up for a site visit, I encourage you to visit our website and to fill that out. That concludes my presentation. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
This is a workshop called For the Birds. It's a workshop to learn about the importance of natives and bird habitats. As Beth said, my name is Max Saran, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Nanticoke Watershed Alliance. I've been serving since August, and I've really enjoyed my time. I've learned so much, and I've learned so much today. So the birds on this title slide, on the left is the cardinal, and in the middle we have a purple martin and a downy woodpecker. So these are all native to the Delmarva area. Why are natives important for birds? Well, more natives mean more food choices and shelter, not just for birds, of course, but for other wildlife too. And as Sydney and Beth talked about, having those pollinators, having those pollinator plants serves food and shelter for pollinators, but it also serves food and shelter for birds as well. So that's really important. Natives can also allow for birds to be more resilient in the face of climate change. For the reasons I just stated, for food and shelter, as weather is adapting and environments are changing, birds can always depend on natives. And that brings me to the next point. When surrounded by natives that birds have evolved alongside, they can more easily find food and shelter. So even though if you decide to create a bird habitat of your own and you have new plants there, it will take some time for the birds to adjust to the environment, but they'll be already familiar with the different natives there. So they'll get adjusted accordingly. And so those are some reasons why natives are so important for birds. So let's talk about some native species. These include flowers, shrubs, and trees, of course. And these are all natives in the Delmarva area that greatly benefit birds. So looking at trees, we have American holly, tulip poplar, and white ash. Looking at native shrubs, we have southern arrowwood, red osier dogwood, and purple cone. For flowers, we have purple coneflower, sunflower, and cardinal flower. So looking at American holly, it serves at least 18 species of birds through the fruit. A couple of birds that eat the fruit from American holly include songbirds and mourning doves. It is native to the eastern and central United States. Blooming occurs between spring and summer, with the berries being produced in the wintertime. And a fun fact about holly is that it is a genus of about 480 species of flowering plants. So obviously there's a whole lot of variety with American holly, a lot of options. And it's always great to see around the holiday time in the winter, especially. Tulip poplar, hummingbirds are particularly fond of its nectar, and yellow-bellied sapsuckers, as the name might suggest, are very fond of its sap. It is native to Eastern North America. Blooming occurs in the spring. And a fun fact is it is a larval host plant for the Eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly. And some other host plants include wild black cherry, sweet bay magnolia, lilac, and willow. And I can remember taking a photo of a tulip poplar, and I was pointing my camera way up into the sky, trying to get a good shot, getting my zoom action going, because they have an average height of 60 to 90 feet. So if you have a small area and you're willing to grow vertically, this is a great option, as it will provide nectar for hummingbirds, as well as just being a great native plant for birds. White ash, the seed serves as an important food source for birds such as the red-winged blackbird, evening grosbeak, pine grosbeak, and purple finch. It is native to Eastern and Central North America. Blooming occurs early summer. And a fun fact is that there's an estimated 8 billion ash trees in the United States. So there's a whole lot. There's green ash, black ash, and white ash, which is pictured here. Next, we have southern arrowwood. This plant attracts eastern bluebird, northern flicker, gray catbird, and American robin. It is native to the eastern United States. Blooming occurs midsummer. And a fun fact is that Native Americans use the stems of this plant for arrows. So I thought that was a pretty interesting fun fact there. Next, we have red osier dogwood. The fruit attracts American robin, northern cardinal, and gray catbird. It is native to northern and western North America. Blooming occurs in the early summer, and a fun fact is that red osier dogwood was a plant referred to as kinnikinnick by Native Americans. And purple coneflower, this is something that Sydney talked about in her presentation. It's a great native to have, both for birds and for pollinators, as seen in this picture. The plant attracts a variety of butterflies like fritillaries, monarchs, and paying ladies. It is native to eastern and central North America. Blooming occurs between midsummer and fall. And a fun fact is that the genus name comes from the Greek echinos, meaning hedgehog, which is a reference to the brownish central disc, which on first look, if from a long distance, it might look like a hedgehog to you. So that's a little fun fact there. Sunflower, this is obviously a very popular native flower to the Delmarva area. Birds often use the sunflower seeds to fuel their long migrations. It is native to North America, of course, and Central America. Blooming occurs during the summer season and into fall. And a fun fact about sunflower is that it was the subject of many of my favorite painter of all time, Vincent van Gogh. He had said that sunflowers represented gratitude. So if you're a fan of Van Gogh and you want to include gratitude in your garden, this is definitely a great native flower to have in your garden. And another favorite of mine is cardinal flower. This plant serves as an important nectar source for ruby-throated hummingbirds, which are native to the Delmarva area. It is native in Canada as well, and it can be found as far down south as Colombia. Blooming occurs in late summer. And a fun fact is that the name cardinal flower actually refers to the scarlet robes worn by cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church. And I had thought that it would be named after the cardinal bird. So I found this to be an interesting fact myself. So of course, these are some common birds of Delmarva. You have probably seen American robins a lot. I know when I was a student at Salisbury University, I would always see American robins. I would just always stop on my way to class just to observe and admire them. Perhaps my favorite bird of all time is the northern cardinal. Just whenever I see it, I just have to stop in my tracks and just admire it until it inevitably flies away from me. Of course, we have brown-headed nuthatch. We have Carolina wren. Blue jays are another great common bird of Delmarva. And of course, we have the Carolina chickadee. So what makes up a bird habitat? Well, they're much like us. We need food, water, and shelter. So for food, they will look for a variety of native plants, ideally that can supply food year-round. So that's why it's great to plant native plants that are good in the spring, in the summer, and in the fall, just so that they're well prepared and they have a food source readily available to them. Water, of course, a freshwater source will attract more species than a bird feeder, but of course a bird feeder can't hurt, and it allows birds a source of water, so it's a great thing to have as well. Of course, birds need shelter. It's best when it's from natural sources such as native trees and shrubs. So the shrubs that Beth talked about in her presentation, a few of those would be great options for shelter. And specifically shrubs of different densities and heights. So birds will like a variety of plants when they have the garden environment available to them. And of course, nesting is a very important part of a bird habitat. It follows the same formula of shelter, with native trees and shrubs being the best source. And to the right is a great photo of some robins feeding some baby birds, which is an adorable picture, I think. So the cycle of life of natives supplying bird food. Here's a syrphid fly on a purple coneflower. We have a potter wasp on an eastern daisy fleabane. So birds, of course, eat flies and wasps. Some birds that eat wasps include the gray catbird. And we also have an emerald ash borer, which is actually a pest to your garden. They attack green and black ash trees before they go to white ash trees specifically, but they can cause havoc in your garden, just destroying trees. And birds will go to eat these insects, and that is a good thing, as it will help reduce damage to your garden. And there's also slugs. Birds eat slugs, and this is a bird on aster, which is also a native plant as well. So this is a great graphic, I think. It's a closer look at bird food. We have a food type column. So we have nuts, seeds, fruit, and nectar. So it provides natural source. So for nuts, that comes from oak, hickory, buckeye, chestnut, and walnut. So it attracts woodpeckers, nuthatches, and jays. Looking at seeds, pine, spruce, sunflowers, coneflowers, asters. There's just so many different natural sources for seeds. And this will be included in the handout that Beth will send. So this is a great resource to look back on. And it also, of course, has fruit and nectar as well. So I think this is a great resource to look at after the presentation, just to sort of think about what you want to have in your garden and what will be attracted to your garden. Next, we have natural nesting materials. So this is a Carolina wren. And I kid you not, when I found this image, it took me a few seconds to find the Carolina wren. But that's important because that means it's a good shelter. It took me a while to notice it. And so obviously that's a great thing to have as far as shelter goes and nesting goes. So they would like dead twigs and leaves, dry grass and leaves, feathers, moss, and pine needles. As you can see, there's some pine needles and some dead trees, dead leaves and dry grass there as well. So that's a great nesting habitat. And as I mentioned, it's a great shelter because it did take me a few seconds to register that the bird was even in that picture. So let's talk about the benefits of bird habitats. A well-constructed bird habitat will bring in both year-round and migrating birds. It also helps to keep birds safe from predators, of course. Having good nesting, good shelter, and a quality waterway does not just serve birds, but other wildlife as well. And it will just attract so many birds and different types of birds, really. So if you're nearby a quality waterway, that is an additional plus for your garden. And additionally, it can help, birds can help to clear out backyard rodents, which is, of course, you think if you would rather have, some bird take away the backyard rodent than your cat bringing it into your house, for example. So that's a great thing about bird habitats. So this is a bird habitat plan called Hummingbird Haven. So red buckeye, wild bergamot, and tulip poplar all attract hummingbirds. And so if you're interested in hummingbirds in particular, this would be a great selection here. But obviously there's many different types of plans that you can look at for attracting different types of native birds. And this is just one example of that. So let's talk about my plan. So this is a house near my apartment. It's about a few minute drive away from my apartment. And I figured, I was looking at this yard and I was thinking, what can I do to sort of, if I was a homeowner, how would I turn this into a bird habitat? So first I would create some small flower beds that consist of cardinal flower, sunflower, and purple coneflower, as cardinal flower and sunflower are two of my favorite flowers of all time. And I would just sort of have it sort of like a path leading into the doorway there. And I would also plant a red osier dogwood, which grows to between 8 to 10 feet. So I would have it sort of in this area, and it would sort of grow up to here about, so that way it's not blocking my window. But also I would also consider having it by my window, because at my apartment here, I have a tree next to my window, and it's just always great to see birds, when I'm waking up, just birds are already out. It's a great thing to see. So positive impacts of birds on other species. Well, first there's seed dispersal. You can see American robin eating a seed right there. And so as birds travel, they will eventually desecrate, and it will allow for plants to sort of grow that way. So when birds are going on their long journeys, they're essentially bringing plants with them, or soon to be plants with them. And so it's a beautiful cycle of life, I think, personally. Of course, there's also a carcass removal. This is not only important just to sort of get rid of carcasses, because you don't want to really see one when you're out walking about, but it also limits disease from spreading to other species, species of birds, other species, and that's just a great addition that birds have on ecosystems. And speaking of ecosystems, they are also ecosystem engineers. So they will build nests, and woodpeckers, for example, will create holes in trees, and this will not only serve as shelter, this will serve as shelter for other species, other organisms that will take over these ecosystems when the birds go away in the wintertime. So they're not only providing their benefits to themselves through nesting and shelter, but they're also indirectly or directly impacting other species positively as well. Some tips for using trees to attract wildlife. It is good to plant a variety of tree species. That way, you have a wide variety of different birds coming in, different pollinators coming in, and it allows just for a greater sense of biodiversity. Avoid planting in isolation and instead go for groups. So planting flower beds is more ideal than just planting in isolation. Of course, feel free to experiment. Try planting some tall trees and some short trees. You might get some good wildlife variety that way. And of course, planting evergreens will provide year-long shelter, especially during the wintertime. It is important to keep in mind that it will take time to see results. Trees, of course, take a long time to grow, but the benefits that come from it are immeasurable, not only to birds, but to several other organisms as well. This is sort of more touching on why natives are the best choice. And Cindy sort of talked about this in her presentation. Well, firstly, they require less water, less mulching, and overall maintenance. So that's a plus. If the garden is properly planted, it costs less to maintain over time. It typically requires less pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, and it also reduces water runoff and flooding. And as I had mentioned earlier, it just helps to add more biodiversity to an area, and having an area that has great biodiversity just is great for all the organisms there, and it just allows for the cycle of life to sort of take its way. So let's talk about how to plant a tree. If there are wires, ropes, or burlaps surrounding the roots, you can go ahead and remove those. You will likely need to use a knife for this. And this is especially crucial when you're planting a tree. Always have a partner to help you. Trees are very heavy. Speaking from experience, as an AmeriCorps member, I've helped with several different plantings, and you think you can handle a tree and then you lift it and it's just no bueno. It's not working, and you have to get somebody to help you. And so when I was doing a planting in Laurel, for example, we had some burlap sacks, and our green infrastructure intern and I were just trying to get these burlap sacks into the hole, and it just takes a lot of effort. Definitely take breaks. If you're planting a lot of trees, be sure to stay hydrated, because planting a tree, it's obviously very beneficial, but it does take a lot of effort sometimes, especially when it is a very heavy tree. So of course, you dig a hole, and the hole should be 2 times as wide as the diameter of the root ball. Obviously, this is the root ball here. Next, set the tree into the center of the planting area, so the upper surface is leveled with the soil surrounding it. So you can see that in the photo here, the root ball is at the surface level. And so then once it's at the surface level, you can move to the next step. You will want to fill the hole with soil. Feel free to move the soil around a bit to try and make sure that the tree is weighted evenly all around. When I was doing that planting in Laurel that I was just talking about, there were some really big trees, and the green infrastructure intern and I, we were sort of in the holes just trying to make sure that the soil was spread evenly all around so that the tree, just wouldn't grow slanted or anything. So just having an evenly planted tree is obviously important. Lastly, you want to place a 3-inch tall donut-shaped layer of mulch around the tree. You want to make sure that the mulch does not touch the actual root of the tree. So this is something that I actually learned upon my first few weeks as a AmeriCorps member. I had gone to Laurel to help with the planting, and I had never really mulched before. I'm sort of a novice when it comes to that. So I learned very quickly to do donut over volcano. As it says in the picture, volcano mulching bad, donut making good. So that's how you want the mulch to look like when you're doing a tree planting. And you're now ready to make a difference. So we really hope that you've been inspired to create a bird habitat of your own. This is a neat little bird habitat in the picture below. We hope that you've been inspired by the other workshops as well, if you want to pursue those paths. Of course, they're all very beneficial to all the organisms, the ecosystem, and it will just be a great project as well for the springtime. And hopefully, we'll be able to help if you would like to reach out. And with that, here are some resources. So the first one is a native landscape plans to grow native. So this is a short little article about native landscape plans. And if you're curious, this is where I got the Hummingbird Haven idea from. And they have so many different other plans that you can look at for attracting other types of birds. The next resource I have is Wacomico River Field Guide. So I'm in the Salisbury area, and there are plenty, this resource has a very in-depth, I think 80-page or so PDF file that has a variety of native birds that are native in Salisbury, of course, but also in the Delmarva area as well. I also have an article that talks about how to attract bug-eating birds. There's also a resource for bird habit necessities from the New York Audubon. And of course, as Beth mentioned in her presentation, Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center is a great resource because there's just so much great information on there. And when I'm learning about a native tree or native flower, I always go to that resource. And a resource that's not on this presentation, but I figure I'd just point it out, is our hashtag Native Tree Tuesday post that we do on our social media. So you can look back on our various social media pages and see our native tree posts that we've done that include fun facts. It has information about height, how to grow the native tree, and it's just a great resource as well. And we hope to start that up pretty soon. And with that, I can take any questions if anybody has any.